A teenage girl had just been pulled from a motel swimming pool when the man who had registered with her as her husband walked to the front desk and asked for their registration card. He took it, packed their belongings, drove away, and was never identified. For the next 55 years, police would not even know the girl's real name. But 4 days earlier, she had been hundreds of miles away in Kansas, and her name was Jolaine Hemmy. Cold Files 9, Pecos Jane Doe. Jolaine was 17 years old and lived in Salina, Kansas, where she was one of 15 siblings in a large family, was remembered as fairly shy, and was working at a local drive-in restaurant. On July 1, 1966, she was seen at work for the last time, and then she disappeared, without even returning to collect her final paycheck. Her family searched for her, but there was no clear explanation for where she had gone, and that is where the first major gap in the story begins. There is no complete public timeline for what happened next, and we do not know when Jolaine met the man who would later appear with her in Texas, who drove there, or whether she chose to make the trip. What we do know is that 4 days after she vanished from Salina, Jolaine was more than 760 miles from home in Pecos, Texas, checking into Ropers Motel with a young man whose real name is still unknown. The man was described as slim, with light-colored hair, and the pair registered at the motel as Mr. and Mrs. Russell Battoun. There was a problem with that information that nobody at the motel had reason to understand yet. There was no confirmed evidence that Russell Battoun was the man's real name, and there was no public proof that Jolaine and the man were actually married. Not long after they arrived, something happened at the motel's outdoor swimming pool, but historical accounts recorded over the years do not agree on every detail of what witnesses saw immediately beforehand. What is known is that Jolaine was found unresponsive in the pool and received emergency medical treatment, while the people in Pecos had no idea that the teenager in front of them had been reported missing hundreds of miles away in Kansas. It was during the emergency surrounding Jolaine's discovery that the man who had checked in with her returned to the front desk and made the decision that would become one of the most memorable details in the entire case. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the man retrieved the motel registration card and said he needed it to confirm Jolaine's identity at the hospital. Reports differ slightly on the exact timing, so it is safer not to reconstruct the event minute by minute. But the central fact is consistent. During the confusion surrounding Jolaine's discovery, the man took the card, packed their belongings, checked out, and left the motel in a relatively new sedan. He was never publicly identified. The card may have looked like nothing more than ordinary motel paperwork, but once it left with him, investigators lost one of the clearest records connecting the pair to the room, a record that could have contained the names they used, handwriting, and other registration information. His motive has never been established, but the practical result was the same. A potentially useful piece of information left the motel with the only person known to have been traveling with Jolaine. The obvious question has remained ever since. If he intended to use the card at the hospital, why did he leave and never return? Investigators in Pecos now face two mysteries at the same time because they did not know who the man was, and they did not know who the girl was either. In 1966, there was no modern national missing person database capable of linking police departments within seconds. No internet search, no shared digital system comparable to what investigators use today, and no forensic genetic genealogy. That meant the Kansas missing person case and the unidentified girl in Texas could remain separate without anyone realizing they described the same person. Jolaine Hemmy remained missing in Kansas, while in Pecos, the young woman became a Jane Doe. Authorities tried to identify her, and her burial was reportedly delayed for roughly 3 weeks, while families with missing daughters came forward to see whether she might be someone they knew, but none of them recognized her. Even so, Pecos did not simply forget her. Local residents helped raise money so the unidentified girl could receive a proper burial. A funeral director donated a casket, and a local business provided clothing. According to later records, flowers continued appearing at her grave over the years, even though the people leaving them did not know her real name. Her headstone reflected the limited information available at the time and read, "Unknown girl drowned, July 5, 1966. That inscription captured the problem. The town knew when she died and where she had been found, but not who she was or how she had come to Pecos. That response matters because Pecos did not know her name, but the town did not completely forget her either. For years, the file remained frozen in that position, with an unidentified girl buried in Texas, a missing teenager still absent from Kansas, an unidentified man who had left the motel, and a registration card that had gone with him. More than 50 years later, the case began moving again, not because a dramatic new witness suddenly appeared, but because investigators revisited old records using tools that did not exist in 1966. In 2019, Ashley Rodriguez, a senior forensic case manager with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, began reviewing the Pecos Jane Doe case, and Pecos Police Chief Lisa Tarango agreed to renew efforts to identify the young woman. By then, many people who had worked on the original case had retired or died, and the surviving records were limited. Instead, one of the most useful leads came from a much more ordinary source, an old funeral home file. A worker connected to the funeral home since 1966 still remembered the unidentified girl and helped locate a file labeled Unknown Ex-Girl, giving investigators a surviving paper trail from a case that had otherwise faded with time. The breakthrough did not begin with DNA. It began with that old paper file, which helped researchers rebuild parts of what had happened after the girl's death and gave them a foundation for the next stage of the investigation. Old newspaper reports and funeral information added more pieces to the timeline, and a facial reconstruction of the unidentified girl was released in 2019 in the hope that someone would recognize her, although it did not lead to an identification. Investigators then moved to exhumation and genetic testing, but the first DNA work did not immediately produce the answer they needed. Eventually, Othram, a forensic DNA laboratory, developed a more detailed DNA profile from bone material, while NCMEC worked with innovative forensic investigations to use genetic genealogy. The process did not instantly produce a name. Instead, researchers had to build family trees, compare relatives, ages, locations, and dates, and gradually narrow the possible family connections until the evidence began to point toward one family in particular. From there, the pieces started lining up. The old newspaper reports had led back to the funeral home records. The funeral home records supported the renewed identification effort. The exhumation provided material for a stronger DNA profile. The profile allowed genetic genealogy to point toward relatives, and those relatives created a possible connection to a teenager who had disappeared from Kansas in July 1966. Investigators located one of Jolaine's living relatives and requested a DNA comparison. NCMEC reported that a potential sibling provided a sample, while later reporting identified the relative as Jolaine's sister, Jolaine Hemmy. The result confirmed what investigators had spent decades trying to learn. Pecos Jane Doe was Jolaine Hemmy. The missing 17-year-old from Kansas and the unidentified girl buried in Texas were the same person. And after 55 years, two timelines that had existed separately finally became one. Once Jolaine had her name back, investigators and her family could revisit details that had been impossible to place in context when she was simply an unidentified girl in Pecos. One of those details came directly from her relatives, who told NCMEC that Jolaine did not know how to swim. That fact does not tell us how she ended up in the motel pool, and it does not prove that another person caused her death, because someone who cannot swim can still enter a pool accidentally or willingly and get into serious trouble. Still, the detail makes the circumstances worth looking at again, especially because the man traveling with her left the motel and was never identified. Another piece of information came from at least one family member who, according to Othram, remembered a man who had shown particular interest in Jolaine around the time she disappeared. Very little about that man has been made public, and there is no public evidence establishing that he was the same person who later checked into Ropers Motel with her, so connecting those two men would go beyond what the known evidence supports. In January 2021, Pecos police made the identification public. Pecos Jane Doe was Jolaine Hemmy, 17 years old, from Salina, Kansas, and missing for only 4 days before her death. For investigators and Jolaine's family, one mystery had finally been solved, but the harder questions remained exactly where they had been for decades. Who was the man at Ropers Motel? What happened during the missing stretch between Kansas and Texas? And what happened at the pool? Genetic testing had answered the identity question, but it could not reconstruct the journey that brought Jolaine to Pecos, explain when she met the man, establish whether she traveled voluntarily, determine whether Russell Battoun was an alias, or show what happened in the hours before she was found unresponsive. Finding her name solved one mystery, but it also made the unanswered part of the case much clearer. What investigators know is limited but important. Jolaine disappeared from Kansas on July 1, 1966, and 4 days later, she was in Pecos with an unidentified young man. They registered as Mr. and Mrs. Russell Battoun. Jolaine was later found unresponsive in the motel pool, and during the emergency, the man retrieved the registration card, gathered their belongings, left the motel, and was never publicly identified. What remains unknown is almost everything connecting those facts. How Jolaine reached Texas, when she met the man, what their real relationship was, whether the name on the motel paperwork belonged to him, exactly how Jolaine entered the pool, and why he did not return. There is no publicly available evidence proving that the unidentified man caused Jolaine's death, and that distinction matters because suspicious behavior can create legitimate investigative questions without proving a crime. His actions remain important because authorities still want to know who he was and what he knew, not because his guilt has been established. That brings the story back to the motel registration card, the small piece of paperwork that was present at the beginning and remained important long after modern science solved Jolaine's identity. 55 years later, investigators recovered her name, but the identity of the man who registered beside her remained uncertain. The card matters not because we know why he took it, but because of what left the motel with him, one of the most obvious contemporary records connecting the couple to that room. Genetic genealogy could connect Jolaine to her family, but it could not recover the missing days between Salina and Pecos, or identify the person who may have known the most about them. In that sense, the case was not fully solved when Jolaine was identified. One question had been answered, while the larger mystery simply became easier to define. For Jolaine's family, that distinction was deeply personal. When she was identified in 2021, 9 of her siblings were reportedly still alive, and they had spent more than half a century without knowing where their sister had gone after she disappeared from work in Kansas. Identification gave them one form of closure because they finally knew where Jolaine had been found and where she had been buried. But knowing someone's identity is not the same as knowing what happened to them. The people of Pecos had lived with a different version of that uncertainty, remembering an unidentified teenage girl whose funeral the community had helped support and whose grave continued receiving flowers even though no one knew her family. Once her name was restored, those two histories finally met. The family who had been searching for Jolaine and the Texas community that had cared for the unknown girl were, in fact, remembering the same person. By 2026, the case was still not closed. On July 6, 2026, around the 60th anniversary of Jolaine's death, Pecos police again appealed to the public for information, with the focus no longer on identifying the girl, but on identifying the man who had been with her at Ropers Motel and understanding the events surrounding July 5, 1966. No one has been publicly identified as responsible for Jolaine's death, and no one has been charged in connection with it. That leaves the case only partly solved. The mystery of who the girl was has an answer, while the questions surrounding how she reached Texas, what happened during those 4 days, who the man really was, and why he left the motel remain open. In some ways, the 4-day gap may now matter even more than the pool itself. On July 1st, Jolaine was in Kansas, and by July 5th, she was more than 700 miles away in Texas, with a man whose identity remains unknown. Somewhere inside that missing stretch of time may be part of the explanation for how she left home, why she was in Pecos, what relationship she had with the man beside her, and what happened before she was found in the pool. The man's decision to take the registration card, leave the motel, and never return deserves attention, but it should not be treated as proof of guilt. Until investigators identify him or uncover new evidence, it remains an unresolved part of the timeline rather than a final answer. For 55 years, this case was largely about giving an unknown girl her name back, and now we know that name was Jolaine Hemmy. That changes the mystery in an important way, because she is no longer just a face from an old file or an inscription on a grave. She was a 17-year-old whose family had been looking for her since 1966. At the same time, knowing who Jolaine was makes the missing pieces harder to ignore, because the question is no longer simply who was buried in Pecos, but what happened between the moment she disappeared in Kansas and the moment she was found in Texas 4 days later. The one person who may have known much of that story is still unidentified, and the small motel record that once connected him to Jolaine disappeared when he left. Jolaine Hemmy eventually got her name back, but the man who registered beside her never did, and decades later, Investigators are still asking who he was, why he left Ropers Motel, and what happened during the missing stretch between Jolaine's disappearance and her death. Somewhere between Kansas and that motel in Pecos may be the answer her family has waited decades to hear. If you enjoy carefully researched unsolved cases like this one, consider subscribing, and as always, thank you for watching.